We are here today with the author of The Yankee Way, a tale of Brian Cashman era for the New York Yankees, author Andy Martino. Andy, thank you so much for joining us today.
Nick, thanks for having me.
So, before we get into the book, friendly reminder everybody, it is released May 21st. So, if you haven't had the opportunity to read it yet, make sure you go out and read the book. I got to ask you, the first question on my mind is what led you to pursue this type of book?
Well, that's an interesting question, Nick. My previous book was about the Houston Astros cheating scandal in the sign stealing era, and a significant thread in that book was involved reporting on the Yankee organization. Now, I've covered this organization for years. It's my job at SNY, so I of course knew Brian Cashman and plenty of his lieutenants. But in reporting on and talking to Yankee people in the context of being one of the victims of this cheating scandal, I just got to know that much more about the front office and how they work and how they build a roster. And I thought you sort of sometimes you leave one project with a seed for the next. And I thought, well, that's a full story that I think I'd like to tell. That and just the fact that, having covered Cashman for many years now, just knowing that he has a lot of obviously a lot of experience, a lot of stories. So the challenge became, can I get some of those stories out of him on the record? Because the Yankees really, because of the continuity that they have in that front office, tell a story of the whole arc of the game from the last 40, 50 years, from what basically looks like the Stone Age now to the age of advanced metrics and analytics and StatCast, and Cashman's been there the whole time. So for all those reasons, I thought that there was a real story to tell there, and that extended beyond just what the New York Yankees went through, and I wanted to try to tell it. So that's how I got started on pursuing the idea.
Now, Brian Cashman's been a part of the Yankees organization basically for his entire adulthood, and you break it down very nicely in the book how he went from an intern to running the biggest franchise in sports. Now, with all his experience, we on the fan side of things haven't really seen Brian Cashman open up. Was there any kind of pushback from him in terms of putting this book together, or was
Oh,
he
yes.
more of an open book?
No, there was pushback. I mean, it wasn't hostile or anything, but I detail this a little in the introduction of the book. As you've seen, I thought, because of that relationship that I had from reporter to GM, which has been, I'd say, mutually respectful, somewhat collegial. Certainly, you wouldn't be friends in that dynamic, but we've gotten to know each other pretty well, and I think he considers my coverage fair. I thought it'd be pretty easy to call him up and be like, "Here's my idea. Can I interview you at length?" And it took me more than 6 months to convince him, and he kept kind of putting me off, like, "Okay, sure, I hear you." And I'd be like, "Well, do you have any concerns you want to express that I can clear up for you?" He'd be like, "No." Okay. So we kind of like the Cashman that you hear on the radio sometimes or in press conferences where you're like, he's so careful and cautious. That's not the guy that I know a lot of the time when you just talk to him casually, but he kind of turned into that when I presented this idea. And I think his concerns had to do with he didn't want him to think he was writing a book. It wasn't the time to do that. He's still in the middle of his career. Obviously, he's an active GM, so he didn't want that perception. I think trusting somebody else, even though I'm someone I think he thinks is fair, trusting me to tell the story of his time with the Yankees is a big leap. And I met with some time and some resistance there, and I finally broke him down, I think, by coming to an agreement of, look, it's not your book. I'm going to interview everyone I could possibly interview who's been around the Yankees for decades and tell the whole story of the franchise. I said to him, you always tell me that the story that's told about the Yankees is wrong. Well, I'm just going to try to get it right. And all he eventually said was, somewhat unenthusiastically, well, if that's what you're doing, I don't have the right to tell you not to write a book. So, all right, good enough for me. And to his great credit, he was open to being interviewed throughout the next couple of years.
And as Brian Cashman said to you, and you mentioned in the book, the story to him is false because there's so many people that along the way played such a big role in this Yankee dynasty. And the sad part about it is a lot of them weren't around to actually see the dynasty actually come to fruition.
That's right. And one of the more surprising little things that he told me, of course, this is that the beginning and the end of the dynasty, in Cashman's opinion, came in the year 1995. That's right. The beginning of the end came before it began, because the people who he believes built that dynasty, these are people like G. Michael, who was soon be out, who was already out as GM by the end of 95, was around, but was out as GM. Then people who hardly anyone's heard of, Bill Livesey, who Cashman considers basically the father of Yankees baseball operations, possibly as much, if not more so, than G. Michael in a lot of ways that I detail in the book. He had been fired by George Steinbrenner. Buck Showalter, who was mentored by Billy Martin and steeped in the Yankee way, he was out when building the Arizona Diamondbacks. Bringing Joe Torre in was like bringing in a total outsider who, I know it's like very contradictory to how fans think of Joe Torre, and he did a lot of good things, won a lot, obviously, but this is someone who did not have that background in their traditions. And there was so much turnover, just as the franchise is about to start winning those championships, that Cashman really felt the people responsible for building them were largely gone. And I talked to a lot of these people who said it was really hard. I mean, they were happy, of course, for the people who were experiencing and the people who were winning, but 96, 98, 99, 2000, a lot of people said, like, geez, you just want to have the chance to stand to the side of a celebration and say, these guys did it. And a lot of the people who were behind the scenes were deprived of that opportunity because George Steinbrenner had already let them go, or they, in the case of Brian Sabian, had decided to go elsewhere with the San Francisco Giants. But yeah, by the time they started winning, Cashman thought the beginning of the end had already happened.
And you mentioned George Steinbrenner. What a polarizing figure in the sport. Now, wasn't the easiest person to work with. And Brian Cashman is probably the best person to attribute to that. If you're Cashman, how do you think he lasted so long in such a position with how much turmoil was around the Steinbrenner era for the New York Yankees?
Well, I asked him that. It's a great question. And I think people forget how much turmoil when you look back into things, because George Steinbrenner kind of went out a winner in the later part of his career. It's easy to forget. The early 80s, it's 1 o'clock in the morning. He storms into the press room. He's like, the GM's out, the pitching coach is the manager, and Billy Martin's the manager. I don't know. He's going to the broadcast booth. Like, it was crazy. And then a month later, something different. It was incredibly really a toxic workplace in a lot of ways, as it described to me. I wasn't there covering it. I'm not that old, but it was described to me that way. And so I said to Cashman, like, when you got offered this job in 98, did you ever think, why would I do this? This runs off people who are lifetime of experience in the game. And he said, I think the reason that I was able to survive it might be because I was raised in this environment. You get people like Bob Watson coming in from other organizations, GM in 96, who think they can handle George Steinbrenner. And then by the end, by 98, Watson is hiding in his office watching soap operas, ordering takeout food, because if he comes out, Steinbrenner's going to scream at him. Literally. And Cashman's like, you know what? I've been doing this since I was 19. I think I have a shot at being able to handle the boss. And he did. Although almost ran him off too. Cashman quit after the 05 season. Was going to go make twice as much money to go run the Dodgers. And Steinbrenner finally offered him, at that point, the power that Cashman felt like any GM needed. And Steinbrenner's credit, he knew to hold on to Cashman. He knew to hold on to G. Michael, even though he jerked him in and out of GM and manager jobs a number of times. There were a few key people that were able to maintain that continuity with Steinbrenner. Cashman's one of the very few. I mean, this guy has nerves of steel to have endured that. This is why handling the New York media, handling the clubhouse, Jeter, A-Rod, all the difficult things that have come his way over the years. I'm sure he would credit George Steinbrenner for helping to toughen his backbone and give him that thick skin to deal with all kinds of things that have come his way and still do.
Yeah, so one of the biggest things with Steinbrenner was he was kind of overriding Cashman on some key moves. You talk about Vladimir Guerrero having a deal with the Yankees, and then Steinbrenner coming in and signing Gary Sheffield. And then you look at a guy like Tony Womack, who really didn't pan out in the Bronx, but Cashman was looking more toward Miguel Cairo. From talking to Cashman about that, what difficulty did that add to the equation while trying to build a championship roster?
Well, can you imagine? The GM wants to sign. The GM thinks he has Vlad Guerrero signed. And the owner says, no, I'm doing Sheffield. He's the right fielder. Like, what? And you mentioned the one Miguel Cairo, Tony Womack, second base. Things like that. How are you supposed to build a cohesive roster when there's like a cabinet of advisors in Tampa, some of whom are Yankee employees, some of whom aren't even, when you have your front office in New York, when you're not always sure what Tampa's doing. it got to be words. The words that were used in describing it to me in my reporting were like manic. It was something that was unsustainable. It was just a very, very difficult way to work. And again, that's why he left, or really literally left after 2005. Told Randy Levine, the president, I'm out. And Levine says to Steinbrenner, you better call Cash. He's leaving. So that was incredibly difficult. No, if Steinbrenner hadn't made that change, Cashman wouldn't have lasted. And then you never know what would have happened had Hal Steinbrenner not taken the reins of the franchise a few years later, because he obviously runs the business in a way that's more rational and even keeled and sustainable for an employee to work in. And Hal's involved and passionate, maybe more so than he seems to the public, but he does let his baseball people do their jobs. And his father didn't always, of course.
Not by any means. And in that 2005 discussion, Cashman made a big change in the Yankees organization, and by bringing more analytic-driven knowledge to the organization. And he saw it with Billy Beane in Oakland and the different things that were happening. For Cashman's sake, why was that such an important part of that negotiation? Yeah, sure, the control of the front office and being able to make the moves and not have to worry about George behind his back doing things. But that analytic part seems like such a key aspect that still today reaps the benefits for the Yankees.
That's right. Well, he kept his ear to the ground. He saw where things were going. I mean, the Moneyball book had already been released by that time. So, he wasn't alone. And the Red Sox tried to hire Billy Beane. Cashman certainly wasn't the only GM to think we need to figure out how this trend can help us. But he was friends with Billy Beane, and he really knew. He said, and Billy Beane gives him credit because he says, a lot of people are giving Beane a hard time for the book. Go, you think you're smarter than us. Oh, you're a self-promoter, all those kinds of things. And Cashman instead was just like, what should I read? Who should I talk to? Because he's like, this is where things are going. And then, you flash forward a decade and a half, and they're at the forefront of the analytics movement to the point where it's become controversial that they're sometimes accused, they object, but accused of being too analytical. So Cashman saw that that's where things were going at the time, in 2005. He was one of just a few organizations to really look in that direction.
You had a great conversation in the book with Garrett Cole and Zach Britton, two pitchers that seem to have a lot of knowledge in terms of analytics. And it seems like both guys have really benefited from that. And we've seen in Yankee past there where guys have come in and there might not have been enough analytics for them to succeed upon. Like now they're starting to reap that benefit, like Sonny Gray being one of them.
Yes. That's a great point. It's significantly increased over the past number of years since Sonny Gray was here, what the Yankees are able to identify and coach and analyze. But what else has ebbed and flowed a little like then, and this is what Britton, who was there obviously longer than Cole, he got there in 18, in my opinion, did a brilliant job of breaking down that progression where, okay, so he was with the Orioles. Their analytics is literally Buck Showalter's notebook, black book in the dugout, and he's writing down tendencies. And Britton would have to call Scott Boras for analytics. The Orioles weren't doing anything. And he gets to the Yankees, and it's information overload. And he's thinking, they're dumping all this stuff into our iPads. But most of these players, especially the young ones, don't know what to do with this information. So then there became a period of adjustment with communication. And, frankly, that's still ongoing. Even since I wrote the book, it's been evolving. So I had that long conversation with Cole and Britton towards the end of the 2022 season, which was kind of smack dab in the middle of my reporting for the book. I circled back to Cole in 23, and he was a month or so into his Cy Young year, and he said, communication's gotten even better. Matt Blake, the pitching coach, has tightened up how he communicates the data. Jose Trevino's been an amazing addition because he understands that stuff, but also reads the game. He knows the script, but he knows the game. And he's combining those. Oh, this hitter's swinging weird at the slider. Let's give that a couple more times, no matter what the data says. So all those things have been an evolution. And then last year, after last season when the Yankees were 82 and 80, took a hard look at their organization on all levels. They made another series of changes where Hal Steinbrenner and Cashman were talking to Cole and Aaron Judge really in depth about how do you get your information and how can we do better. And I just talked to Cole a week ago, the Yankees' previous homestand, and he's saying it's even better now this year how it's being communicated. So this is an ongoing project, and this is across the sport. Sandy Alderson, obviously the founder of Moneyball, Billy Beane's mentor, was the one who kind of brought analytics into baseball. And I said to him during the reporting for this book, what's the next frontier? It was on-base percentage 35 years ago. What's the next thing? And he said, it's not a metric anymore. It's the human art of empathy and implementation and being able to communicate these things. And that's what the Yankees are still working on.
Yeah, absolutely. But I have to backtrack a little. We have to talk about Derek Jeter and Alex Rodriguez, two
Yeah.
of the biggest stars in the game at their respective time. And Brian Cashman goes out and acquires Rodriguez to play third base. And there was a lot of hostility between Jeter and Rodriguez there. Now, Jeter, as you say in the book, wasn't always necessarily fond of Rodriguez for the past comments. Did that riff cause more drama than the average fan would know?
Yes. And the fans were onto it to some extent at the time. I mean, everybody saw the way they glared at each other in 2006 when that pop-up dropped and they kind of ran into each other in the infield. Iconic moment of conflict. And it was a topic during their years, but they would always say, oh, no, the media is overblowing it. No. I talk to teammates, Cashman and his assistant Gene Ackerman and all kinds of people on the record and teammates speaking anonymously because they still don't want to get in the middle of all this, saying like this was a challenge in that clubhouse because it was tense. And Jeter and A-Rod, it wasn't always bad. They weren't always at war, but there was this underlying tension that was definitely something that the team had to overcome. And it came to a point before the 09 season when Cashman really felt like I've got to fix this and brought in CC Sabathia, not just because of his pitching, but because he's kind of a connector, a unifying type. And at that point, the clubhouse becomes CC and John Damon and Nick Swisher and a whole new thing. The Jeter and Posada, more strict and conservative leadership model, the Yankees start to move on from that. Now, I don't want to be too critical of that because the Jeter Posada model has more rings than anything that's coming after. So I'm not saying that was all bad, but I am saying that the dynamic of the people who had won championships with the Yankees in the late 90s and in 2000, definitely the way it was described to me by many people began to feel like there was a caste system between those people and Jeter at the forefront. And then the next group that came in, whether it's an A-Rod, whether it's a Giambi, whether it's Sheffield, Damon, it's like one with us or you didn't. And through that decade of the 2000s, that was a drift that was an issue for the Yankees and a management challenge for the general manager.
Now, it's in Cashman's seat, Rodriguez hits free agency. And the Yankees, at that point, Rodriguez was one of the best players in the game. Was that the reason why they signed him? Were they thinking, maybe we can mold them together and kind of have them coexist to get that championship?
Not really. A-Rod opts out in the World Series famously. And at that point, I think the Yankees are done with him at that point, 2007. And Cashman always defended A-Rod with Jeter. And it's not like Cashman was like, oh, get rid of this guy. But I think you'd be hard-pressed to find very many general managers that want to give out any of these 8, 9, 10-year contracts ever. They prefer flexibility. I'll give you a recent example. The teams that missed out on Yoshi Yamamoto when the Dodgers got him last offseason were tremendously relieved that they did not get him. Maybe the owners weren't happy. Maybe the fans weren't happy. But if you're in baseball ops, you're like, oh, my God, thank God, that's $330 million that we have to spend on, 10 players now. So the Yankees are ready to let A-Rod go. But A-Rod basically ended up working out a new contract with ownership and with team president Randy Levine, kind of went around his own agent, Scott Boras. So that was a deal that actually didn't have a lot to do with Cashman and baseball ops. Kind of a throwback to the way things used to be when Cashman wasn't. There's always going to be a lot of cooks in the kitchen with the Yankees. And the process is more streamlined by 07. You still have moments like that where that was a deal that was kind of made, not entirely involving the GM.
And the Yankees are kind of that, along with the Dodgers, those two teams that people say, you go out and you spend money and you spend big. And the Yankees have kind of shied away from that in recent years, and other teams haven't. Yeah, sure, you sign Aaron Judge to a big contract and Garrett Cole, but they're being more cautious in who they sign as opposed to in the past where they were basically throwing money at the best players available.
And I'm sure they would argue a couple things to that. There's a lot of defensives in the Yankee organization, fairly enough, in my opinion, about how they always have a top 1, 2, 3 payroll in the sport. So when Hal Steinbrenner is called cheap, it's like, cheap? Have you seen my bank account? I'm out $300 million in this year's payroll. That kind of thing. And they'd also probably argue that in the era of collecting stars and free agents, that wasn't really how they won. They won by George Steinbrenner being gone in the early 90s and not trading people and being very judicious with who you signed. Now, they were very, very good in the 2000s when it was Messina, Giambi, Matsui. I mean, it's not like they ever went into a down period because of their spending. And then, of course, in '09, they had a free agent spending spree with CeCe and AJ Burnett and Teixeira that worked. So it's hard to say, to generalize and say one thing is good and one thing is bad, but any GM, and include the Dodgers in this, they just went on this huge spree, but it was with a lot of deferred money. And if you look at the free agents the Dodgers have taken a pass on over the last decade, it's actually pretty significant. And I think Steve Cohen's Mets are going to be the same way. They're not going to try to collect all these 10-year contracts, like live in the moment with free agency. That's just not how any team really thinks, like how you build a sustainable winner. So the Yankees are one of the teams that has that contemporary outlook, but also one of the teams that spends still obviously at the top of the industry.
And going back to those championship teams in the late 90s, you look at those teams, a lot of it was homegrown guys, and they made moves that were productive. They got Tino Martinez in a trade. They took a chance on Scott Brosius, who ended up being a big part of that team. So a lot of it kind of seemed to be, yeah, we have our homegrown talent, but we have to make the right moves in order to supplement that roster.
It's great scouting. It's savvy trades. It's you spend where you have to, but if you want to take it into a contemporary example, would you rather identify, trade for, and then coach Clay Holmes to become better? Or would you rather, I don't know, who's the last big free agent closer that's been out? Would you rather give $100 million to Josh Hader? I'd rather pay Holmes a significantly less amount to be as effective. And Scott Brosius is an example from 3 decades ago is another example. So it's about having good baseball people and then knowing when to splurge. Like, okay, CeCe, let's splurge. Garrett Cole's a free agent. There's a splurge. So combining those two approaches.
Now, just to kind of go off of the splurging a little bit, Juan Soto, big free agency coming up. He's a guy you splurge on, in my opinion. You could say I'm wrong, but he's a guy age-wise, productive-wise, and what he brings to the organization. Now, from your experience of this, how long in terms of years do you think these big market teams are going to be willing to go?
With a guy that age, I think it's going to be at least 10. What did Bogarts get? 12 or 13 off the top of my head. I mean, some of that is done to stretch it out for luxury tax purposes or lower annual value. But Soto's going to get 12, 13 years more, something like that, because of his age and how good he is, his marketability, and the fact that the Yankees and the Mets are both going to want him, and that's certainly going to help Scott Boras drive up the price. And I mean, that's going to be, I think when all's said and done, that could be the highest paid free agent deal of all time. If you consider Ohtani's $700 million to be a fake $700 million because of all the deferred money, which most people do, Soto might get that in real dollars or close to it.
Just the difference in dynamic of what he brings to the table, and kind of shifting over to his outfield counterpart, Aaron Judge. We all saw that free agency, and we saw how that kind of played into everything. And you talk about your situation in the book about the Yankees and the Mets and the potential collusion. As a Yankees fan, I think we all loved it because we're like, all right, Steve Cohen's willing to spend. Let's rule out the Mets there. But Judge's free agency, it always felt on the outside that he was trying to come back to the Yankees, but was trying to toy them into the right deal.
I think there's a lot of truth to that. I think he was genuinely not sure how it was going to go when he left. When the Yankees lost the ALCS that year, he was saying things to clubbies and people around the team like, all right, been great. Thanks a lot for everything. And it felt like, geez, you're really getting ready to leave. But then he'd say to other people like, all right, let's get back here and win it all. And I think a fair way to read that is that he was uncertain and he was torn, and he was definitely, he said, intrigued by the idea of playing for his hometown San Francisco Giants. That was really interesting, and they were really interested in him. Ultimately, he played the free agency very well. Like, there's that anecdote where there was this like TMZ video of like, "Oh, Aaron, what are you doing in San Francisco?" His agency set that up. It's cool. Like, it's part of the gamesmanship of free agency. Like, I got a couple meetings. He did one of those. And so you could say that sort of thing was strategic. Yeah, my contribution to it, for if some people aren't familiar, was not one that was particularly fun for me, but I just reported accurately that the Mets weren't in on him, but the union saw that as like an inappropriate thing for the two teams to have potentially agreed upon. So there was a collusion investigation, which the sides didn't collude on that, so nothing came of it. But that was like another thing that was dramatic. Then there was the report that Arson Judge was going to the Giants, and that was dramatic. And there was just a lot of drama. And being at the winter meetings with the Yankees, they were very uncertain. They were sweating it out. When that report came out about the Giants, it was like you could hear a pin drop in the Yankee suite, and they're like, "Oh no!" And then I was with some of the guys that night because winter meetings, you're all in the same hotel, so it's not hard to run into people. And there was a lot of like, "Well, what do we do? Do we sign Brandon Nell or Carlos Correa, or like what's going to happen? What if he leaves?" So they really didn't know. And there's this really funny moment. I didn't see it, but I reported on it, where Jim Hendry, who was in the front office and like a real old school kind of guy, he's funny. And Aaron Boone's like, "Should I call him?" And Henry's like, "You're the goddamn manager of the New York Yankees. Of course you should fucking call him. Man up," kind of thing. So he calls him, and eventually it did seem like what Judge wanted, but the Yankees had to get him there to what he thought was a fair deal, and it was a ninth year that got the deal done in the middle of the night, and everything was fine. But it wasn't necessarily like meant to be the whole time. It was very uncertain.
Yeah, and then his note saying from when he was a kid saying that he wanted to play for the Giants, that had to leave a
Right?
lot of Yankee fans a little nervous there, especially
A
given,
lot of Yankee
this guy.
officials nervous, and not
Oh,
just
for
fans.
sure.
They were like, "What is this?" Yeah.
The guy you build around for years and you think is going to be the cornerstone of your franchise is thinking about playing in his hometown in San Francisco. It's not an
Right?
easy thing to think about if you're the Yankees, especially all the
No.
investment they put on him and how much he's loved by the fan base. Now, from your perspective, I hear it a lot from fans saying, the Yankees aren't trying to win. They're not built the same way. What do you, on your end, I hope you would see it from a different perspective, but that kind of fan base belief, do you get a sense of that, or is it the complete opposite?
Do I get a sense that there's anything to that belief?
Yeah, like
Um,
that the organization's just looking to make money. They're not worried about
oh my
actually
God,
putting a
no.
winning team on the field.
There's a lot of uh, they are starting to be in another World Series and to win another World Series, and there is. I don't want to use the word desperate because they're like process oriented and they know what they're doing, and they're not making like wildly irrational decisions, but there is a sense of pressure. Like, why has this taken so long? And we got to get back there. I think that if Yankee fans and Yankee officials got together, they'd probably have more in common than any other side would think. Like, God damn, it's been a long time. I know. I think it would be like they're very, very proud of, as they should be, of the fact that they haven't had a losing season and how hard it is to contend every year. I know there was a little defensiveness internally, which I understood about after 22, it's like blow up the team, fire everybody. It's like we were in the Final Four. Yeah, we got swept in the ALCS, but they're like, come on, we were there. What do you want? So there's some definitely disagreement or different perspectives between an angry fan and an angry front office member, and where they're each is coming from. But the idea that they don't want to get back, or that they care about money or whatever else, that's crazy to me to hear, because I'm around these people and they are so frustrated. I've been around them. I've been at the ballpark every Yankees have been eliminated in the postseason since, I don't know, 17, 18, whenever this run started, and it is rough. Got a 19 after Altuve hit the home run. They were crying. I mean, the players, the manager. It's been rough for them to not get back there. So no, the passion is equal on all sides of this. I can attest to that.
That's good to hear because from a personal standpoint, I always felt that with Brian Cashman at the helm, that never changed. And when you go and you win 4 World Series in a short span of time and then face a drought like they did, it's a tough pressure, and that's what they're currently dealing with right now. But you see the moves to get like a Soto, Garrett Cole. They're not shying away from spending money, but they're trying to spend the money wisely.
Right, right. I mean, when you lock yourself up with A-Rod's second contract, or Jacoby Ellsbury's contract, or some would argue Stanton's, I think that's more borderline. And I don't think that's a slam dunk bad move for them, but that's another discussion. But anyway, you lock into a lot of these big contracts, and if they're chosen unwisely, it can really hamstring you in what you can do in the luxury tax world, which every single franchise is concerned about. The Mets were impacted in their decisions with the luxury tax this past winter. I mean, everyone uses that as a consideration. So yeah, they have to be careful not to make bad decisions. Sometimes they do, of course. There are no certainties in this game, but yeah, they, in terms of urgency to win, you mentioned Soto. Look at that. That doesn't mean that they're going to desperately chase every free agent, of course. Like I think if you're looking at the, they could have paid Blake Snell, whether it was 150, 160 million or something, and they ended up giving Stroman a fraction of that for fewer years. I mean, Snell eventually took less for the Giants. What I'm saying is what they offered Snell in January and instead pivoted Stroman. That's probably a better contract, a Stroman contract. I know everyone wanted Snell, but if you look at the fact they're not tied up in something for years, if you look at how Snell's been pitching so far, they're trying to make wise decisions and not just go with, oh my God, we need to win, get Blake Snell. But it was, oh my God, we need to win, get Juan Soto. They didn't. There's a lot of urgency there. It was not a rational trade to trade like 50 years of pitching. Juan Soto, headlined by Michael King, who's terrific, and they felt like, screw it, we need Soto. We got to get back to the World Series. So they've got that in them too. I think, and fans probably want to hear that.
And one of the deals that Yankee fans were so upset about was Robinson Cano. Look at how that deal turned out. Imagine if the Yankees would have gave him that money in those years, and then look what happened. He had the steroid issues. His play took a deep decline as the years went on. It wasn't like that was a great deal either, and they avoided the bullet there with that kind of contract.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great call. And again, there's a lot of risk and a lot of protection, and it's really hard. But their record in it is pretty good, with marked by some mistakes, of course. But overall, they're pretty rational about things. And I know that doesn't really play in the off season when people like just acquiring is fun. Hey, my team is making acquisitions. Of course, that's fun. But when you're winning every year, it pays off, I guess, which the Yankees are, as they like to point out, because they feel like people don't think they're winning every year when they actually are.
Now, back to the book. I have another question for you on that. When you were going through this process, and it was a long process, it took you a couple of years to write. Was there something that you learned that kind of surprised you along the way? Like, was there something or someone that stood out the most to you?
Well, someone is a great question. I really hope people read about Jack Butterfield, Bill Livesey, the contributions by Brian Sabian, the way that the dynasty was built and the Yankee philosophies were built by people who get no attention. And that was a huge thing. I mean, there's a lot of Jeter, A-Rod, Torre, like big names in this book, but I'm most invested in, I think, people knowing about these unsung heroes, because that's a story that has hardly been told. And everything I learned about these guys, I guess, surprised me because there's so much that I didn't know. So there's that. And then another very specific thing is the story had never been told about how Cashman and Torre had a falling out. And I was able to find out that story. So that was pretty interesting. I mean, I'll say in a nutshell, it was over, from reading the book. In 2007, it was over Ron Guidry, an old school pitching approach, and an office that was filming bullpen sessions, and Torre feeling spied on, and Cashman feeling lied to, and they had a big blow up over that, over a rehabbing reliever named Coulter Bean and how many pitches he threw, of all people. It's like a divorce. You fight the thing that actually breaks you up. I don't have experience with divorce, to be clear, but the idea that when you have a breakup, it's like maybe a fight about the dishes that actually ends up ruining the relationship, ending the relationship. It's so many little things over the years. So I found out what the thing was between Cashman and Tori, and it was an argument over Coulter Bean and a bullpen session being filmed. So that was interesting to me to learn.
That was definitely interesting. And there are so many unsung heroes and so many untold stories that you break down in the book, The Yankee Way. Make sure you go out May 21st. The book is on sale. It's a must read. I must tell you that. Andy Martino, thank you so much for your time today. It was great talking about the book and the Yankees with you, and best of luck as the book gets released.
Thank you very much, Nick. I appreciate it.